Hello, my name is Jeremy Hunt. Welcome to my latest 10-minute video on the 3 qualities that are essential for our next Prime Minister. In a few weeks, we'll probably have our 5th Prime Minister in less than 5 years. There's been quite a lot of angst about Britain going Italian, and it's not entirely unfair because a root cause of recent instability has been the collapse of the UK's traditional two-party system into a more fluid multi-party system, something with which Italians are very familiar. But part of the reason has been failures in leadership, which haven't delivered change at the pace voters expect. Is that the fault of politicians who have overpromised and under-delivered? Do we just expect too much of our prime ministers? I think it's a different issue. Leaders need 3 distinct qualities, but few politicians possess all 3. Now, I've worked closely with 4 prime ministers since 2010, and governing a democracy is difficult. You have to make promises to win an election and then deliver them quickly. There's no longer any guaranteed honeymoon period. But if there is one, it'll be short. And when the next election is several years off, backbenchers still get spooked by scandals, setbacks, and local election results, as Keir Starmer's just found out. And it's got harder. Mainstream politicians haven't yet learned to communicate effectively on social media. You can love or loathe his policies, but Donald Trump is probably the most effective communicator of any elected politician on the planet. His mastery of social media meant, for example, that despite promising to end wars, not start them, his military action against Iran was supported by 84% of Republican voters at the outset. But he hasn't got there by accident. He reportedly spends up to 3 hours every day either watching TV, on TV, or on social media. Being a good communicator helps win elections, but it doesn't make you a good leader. And I've concluded that requires 3 essential qualities. So here goes. The first is to be able to persuade people of the need for trade-offs if we're going to solve difficult problems. Welfare reform, for example, is challenging but necessary if we're going to stop parking vulnerable people on benefits in a way that will severely limit their self-respect and chance of a decent life. Ducking it means taxes will have to go up in a way that stifles economic growth. It's the most pressing trade-off that Andy Burnham will face when he arrives in No. 10. But will he be bold enough to take on his backbenchers? Tony Blair took on the Labour Party when he announced plans to abolish Clause 4 of its constitution. Margaret Thatcher took on the Wets in her own party to deliver painful economic reforms. Both liked big, bold battles. But it can be done in a more consensual way. Germany's most effective post-war leader, Konrad Adenauer, persuaded West Germany of the need to join NATO and even host American bases in a period when neutrality would have been much more popular. He did it not through soaring oratory, but through patience and building trust. Elected leaders, as he showed, need to shape as well as listen to public opinion. But being good at winning an argument isn't on its own enough, because hope isn't a strategy. And that's why prime ministers also need a second vital quality: the ability to turn an inspiring vision into real change. President Lyndon Johnson was not a very attractive personality, but passed some of the most important legislation of the 20th century. In a country riven by racial divisions, his 1964 Civil Rights Act ended segregation, and his 1965 Voting Rights Act outlawed the disenfranchising of black voters. He got them through Congress by knowing the desires and vulnerabilities of individual senators, personally approving the transactional deals necessary to get the job done. That was because LBJ understood that promises have to be delivered. And sometimes that's not about laws, but administrative competence. When Andy Burnham was a minister in the new Labour government, there was a highly effective civil servant, Michael Barber, in charge of the No.10 delivery unit. With the full backing of the Prime Minister, he made sure there was a relentless focus on reforming public services. School class sizes and NHS waiting times both went down significantly. So what would be the equivalent delivery challenge today? The most important thing is surely to get the economy out of its low growth trap. One of the reasons Keir Starmer's government collapsed was because he couldn't find enough money for defence. But an extra 1% of GDP gives the Chancellor an extra 10 to 12 billion pounds of tax revenues to spend. That's an enticing prospect. Getting there, however, needs disciplined focus on the details of planning reform, on energy policy, on AI adoption, public service reform, and business taxation. I look at all these areas in more detail in my new book, Can We Be Rich Again? The book's an optimistic take on what's possible, but will Andy Burnham and his new Chancellor put enough time and focus into the detailed legwork necessary to turn around the economy? Finally, there's a third quality leaders need, which is to be streetwise enough to stay in power for a long enough time to allow changes to put down roots. In a democracy, the clock is always ticking, but many important reforms take longer than one electoral cycle to bear fruit. Without an element of ruthlessness and cunning, leaders find themselves outmaneuvered by rivals. Australian Prime Minister John Howard would spend most Sundays on the phone to his backbenchers. He stayed in control of his party and won 4 elections in a row. Australia's economy still benefits today from the reforms that he put in place. Longevity matters for ministers as well as prime ministers. So one thing Andy Burnham could do from day one is keep his ministers in post for long enough to master their brief and make a lasting difference. Frequent reshuffles are a tempting way to assert prime ministerial authority, but they come at a heavy price if you want to make reforms that stand the test of time. Is it surprising that HS2 was such a debacle when we've had 7 transport secretaries in the last 10 years? The challenge, of course, is few leaders have all 3 qualities: the ability to win an argument for change, administrative competence, and political nous. That's why the smart ones surround themselves with teams who can compensate for any gaps. Margaret Thatcher had Bernard Ingham to help keep the media at bay. David Cameron had Oliver Letwin to help with a detailed implementation of manifesto promises. Perhaps that's what Keir Starmer intended with Morgan McSweeney and Sue Gray, and his operation fell apart pretty quickly after they left. But Britain is not ungovernable, nor are the challenges we face any harder than in the past. But as the removal vans once again head for Downing Street, political parties need to remember the difference between winning an election and governing. Good communication can get you into office, but only effective leadership will keep you there. That means being able to persuade, deliver, and survive. Thank you for listening.